My name is Howard Louthan. I'm professor of history and director of the Center for Austrian Studies here at the University of Minnesota. And we're delighted that you've decided to spend some time with us this afternoon. I think you're in for a real treat as we have our guest, my friend and colleague, Professor Tryntje Helfferich from the Ohio State University. Professor Helfferich is an associate professor in the Department of History at Ohio State, where she has been since 2007. There are a number of wonderful things that I can say about her, but one thing I really wanted to sort of highlight in particular about her scholarly achievements is a great service that she has done for those of us who teach Central Europe, especially in the early modern period. I think one of the great challenges that we face in the classroom is the lack of primary source material in English. And charging to the rescue, Tryntje has come with, I think we're up to, is it 4 anthologies of primary source documents that she's brought into play, including this most recent one. I believe this is the most recent one on Martin Luther. But actually, I would highlight 2 wonderful collections that she's done on the 30 Years' War, which will be the topic of her talk today. So, I mean, this is for those of you who want to learn more, who want to look particularly at some of the primary source material, I would highly recommend. I should also note that Professor Helfferich is author of really a wonderful book, Amalia, Elizabeth, and the 30 Years' War. Now, this book is terrific on a number of counts. First of all, it's just a fine piece of scholarship, great archival work, close reading of sources, fine analysis of texts, everything that you'd expect out of an excellent historical monograph. But what's even better is that it's a fabulous story. She tells the story of a young woman who lost her husband and has to, during the midst of what turns out to be the greatest war, the greatest cataclysm in Europe up to the First World War, who's this woman who's able to hold together a small state, the state of Hesse-Kassel, is able to secure the succession of her children, maintain the welfare of her citizens in a very, very, very challenging environment. She was a real survivor, which gets around to the theme of today's talk with what probably is sort of the best titled talk that we've had this year, Polyphemus's Supper, Surviving War in 17th Century Europe. So I will turn things over to Professor Helfferich, but before she comes on, I would ask you or remind you that we are recording this lecture right now. And so you may want to obviously both mute yourself, but also turn off your video as well until we come to question time, and then we can come on and have a regular dialogue there. So Professor Helfferich, take us away.
So hopefully everyone can see the screen. And I'll just start right in. So according to the story related in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus, or Ulysses, as he is often termed in English, while attempting to sail home after the Trojan War, reached the island of the giant Cyclops. There he and his crew snuck as thieves into the cave home of one of them, Polyphemus, and helped themselves to his food. When the giant returned, however, the men were trapped. Undeterred, bold Ulysses demanded from the giant the courtesies of hospitality in the name of Zeus, the god of guests. But as Ulysses then related, devoid of pity, the giant was silent in response, but leaping up, laid hands on my crew. 2 he seized and dashed to the ground like whelps, and their brains ran out and stained the earth. He tore them limb from limb for his supper, eating the flesh and entrails, bone and marrow, like a mountain lion, leaving nothing. Helplessly, we watched these cruel acts, raising our hands to heaven and weeping. When the Cyclops had filled his huge stomach with human flesh and had drunk pure milk, he lay down in the cave, stretched out among his flocks. Although stories of the cyclops Polyphemus were known among elite Europeans of the medieval era, full Latin or vernacular editions of Homer's Odyssey, along with other ancient mentions of the giant by Ovid, Euripides, Aristophanes, and others, only became available in Western and Central Europe in the later 15th century through the work of Italian humanists, who eagerly translated older Greek editions that had accompanied refugees fleeing the fall of Byzantium in 1453. The story appealed to early modern tastes, and thus by the late 16th century, literary and artistic references to Polyphemus were common, with some emphasizing his enormous size or monstrous brutish nature, while others focused instead on his legendary musical skill or on the romantic legend of his ill-fated love for the sea nymph Galatea. Other authors and artists took an interest in Polyphemus's taste for human flesh, a detail that appeared both in Homer's story and in the works of Virgil, who described the giant as feeding, quote, on clotted gore of disemboweled men. This cannibalism, and it was indeed described as such, ignoring the issue of whether cyclops are technically even human, was not just a gruesome detail, but like most classical references employed by pre-modern thinkers and artists, was frequently used for metaphorical effect and to highlight a larger point. During the first half of the 17th century, for example, a time when all of Central Europe was convulsed by the bloody, decades-long 30 Years' War, this trope was employed by numerous writers and preachers to attack the evils of war, and particularly war among fellow Christians. Such a metaphorical interpretation of this tale of a cannibalistic giant was not unique to this era, of course. The late medieval French theologian Jean Gerson, for example, had once used the story in an allegorical sermon to advance then stalled peace talks between the kings of France and England. Those of poor intention, he argued, who for vengeance or the profit they can make in pillage or who otherwise wish to have war, must be reputed more cruel than the one having the name Polyphemus, of whom the poets Ovid and Virgil speak, who lived on human flesh. In 17th century Central Europe, however, a time during which warfare was ubiquitous and classical references of all kinds were extremely fashionable, Polyphemus took on an oversized, if I may, role in public discussions about the follies of Christian civil war. Few at the time could doubt that the 30 Years' War, like Polyphemus, was also feeding on human flesh, consuming ordinary lives and communities down to, quote, the marrowy bones, just as the Cyclops had done to his poor victims. But how could Central Europeans, whether common peasants, urban elites, or princes, escape the many horrors of this conflict? Using as a rhetorical frame the story of Ulysses' successful attempt to avoid becoming Polyphemus' supper, just as 17th century thinkers and artists did, the rest of this talk will examine people's survival tactics, which included everything from negotiation and persuasion, to fighting back, to flight and trickery. Part 1, negotiation and persuasion. When first trapped in Polyphemus's cave, Ulysses attempted to talk his way out of trouble. "We are Achaeans returning from Troy," he told the giant, "driven over the ocean depths by every wind that blows. Heading for home, we were forced to take another route, a different course, as Zeus, I suppose, intended. We, for our part, come hoping for hospitality and the kindness that is due to strangers. Good sir, do not refuse us. Respect the gods. We are suppliants, and Zeus protects visitors and suppliants. Zeus, the god of guests, who follows the steps of sacred travelers." During the 30 Years' War, one of the most well-studied ways in which communities attempted to use negotiation and persuasion to alleviate or avoid violence is something historians term the contribution system. This was a new system of military financing that resembled modern-day protection rackets. Local rulers and communities would negotiate and agree to provide voluntary contributions toward the support of an invading army. And in return, the officers would agree not to allow their soldiers to attack, kill, burn, and loot civilian homes and towns. When an army approached a territory or city it intended to put under contribution, its general or commanding officer would inform the local prince or city council of this intention. Negotiations would then commence as to the exact specifics of the agreement. This would usually include some indication of the length of time the officer intended his forces to remain in the locality, the number of men who were to be supplied by locals, and the type and quantity of those supplies. Sometimes money was given instead of food and fodder, with soldiers then expected to purchase what they needed from local merchants. A soldier marching through Pomerania, for example, noted that wherever we camped overnight, the head of the household had to give each of us a half-thaler, but it was for the best, since then we were satisfied with him and let him keep his livestock in peace. Similarly, a peasant in Ulm in 1628 noted in his journal that an arriving cavalry colonel made an agreement with the lords, which was straightway posted in the land, that no peasant had to give anything more to the cavalry than wood, straw, hay, candles, and salt. And in return, the lords of Ulm had to give to every single cavalry captain 50 thalers. And as a cavalry captain received 50, a lieutenant also received 25, an ensign 20, and a corporal 9 thalers, and every single cavalryman 3 thalers. Large armies or longer-term occupations were more difficult for local communities. In early 1642, for example, when the French general Guebriant occupied an area along the Rhine, he demanded and received food, supplies, and lodging sufficient to maintain his entire army of approximately 20,000 men, mostly German mercenaries, for over 9 months. In 1645, the French army under the Duc d'Enghien and General Turenne, acting in conjunction with the Swedish general Königsmark, moved into the area of Darmstadt and forced the city to furnish it with supplies. The agreed upon amount included 200,000 pounds of bread, 50 cartloads of wine and beer, and vast quantities of peas and lentils for the soldiers. And for each general, an additional cartload of wine, 1 of beer, 500 pounds of rye bread, 100 pounds of wheat bread, 4 calves, 8 ewes, 12 lambs, young chickens, turkeys, geese, fish, butter, spices, and more. When city residents struggled to fulfill these demands, the soldiers, unsatisfied with their rations, engaged in almost unbridled looting until Königsmark intervened. While these agreements were made between army officers and local rulers, it was primarily ordinary peasants, villagers, and townfolk who had to bear the financial burdens, as well as the stress of being forced to lodge sometimes violent or dangerous soldiers in their private homes. Rather than merely suffer such hardships in silence, peasants often attempted to mitigate excessive extractions of contributions or misbehaving soldiers by issuing direct appeals for relief to their own authorities or to the occupying military offices. Interestingly, there is also some research into the ability of peasants in this period to challenge such injustices and address grievances through legal court systems, and failing that through such tactics as sabotage or refusal to work. That such appeals or efforts were attempted and that they were sometimes successful suggests that peasants were not entirely passive victims without recourse in these circumstances, but were willing to navigate whatever paths lay open to them to produce favorable results. Studies have thus shown that these contribution agreements, struck by desperate rulers or city councils, while undoubtedly exploitative of the general populace, did allow numerous communities throughout the war to limit the effects, of wartime violence. In many other cases, however, where armies were uninterested in negotiated extractions or were intent on killing and looting despite the written terms of such agreements, there was little that could be done. In these cases, and in the same way that Ulysses appealed to Polyphemus in the name of Zeus and the moral obligations of hospitality, we see German governing authorities attempt moral persuasion through appeals to Christian values and principles of justice. In 1622, for example, Archbishop Ferdinand of Cologne wrote to the imperial ambassador in Spain to complain of the brutality and mistreatment of his people then under military occupation by the Protestant Duke Christian of Brunswick. He described how the Duke, with wicked intention and a fiery hand, and despite a signed contribution agreement, quote, took our subjects prisoner, bound them, beat them, martyred some of them to death, and ruined an emaciated people such that they, out of pure terror, misery, and distress, ran to and fro into the woods and valleys, scattering out along with their wives and innocent children, who, because of the extremely cold winter and the raw weather, must surely die and wither from the hunger and pain. And in the meantime, he seized for himself or spoiled all of their supplies, livestock, grain, and more, and finally burnt their houses to ashes. He took possession of entire villages, market towns, princely and noble houses and cities, and along with the cathedral college and the parish church, plundered, ruined, and burnt them down one after the other. Not to mention the kinds of bad words unbecoming of a prince he and his supporters used, and the deeds, disgraces, sacrileges, and blasphemies they perpetrate. Yes, the Turks and Tatars think and act no worse and in no less a Christian manner. After describing these horrors, the archbishop begged for assistance from the Spanish, whose armies then controlled the nearby Lower Palatinate. Stressing his long devotion to the Catholic cause and to the combined interests of the German emperor and the Spanish king, the archbishop stated his confidence that the king would not allow him and his people, quote, to be plunged into such suffering and ruin, or to be abandoned to such vile robbery, but rather that he shall, by his mighty hand, help to protect and shield us against such unjust violence. Many similar pleas for assistance to end the violence can be seen throughout the decades of the war, issued by rulers and governing bodies at all levels of German society. So too were there numerous more formal efforts at peacemaking, many lasting for years, including the final peace negotiations in Westphalia that did eventually end the war in 1648. In the meantime, however, all efforts to end the war bogged down, sucked into irrelevance by European rulers, seemingly more pressing political, ideological, or economic reasons to continue fighting. So perhaps at this point, it's important to note that while the 30 Years' War was primarily an internal German struggle over the political and religious makeup of the Holy Roman Empire, and was fought primarily on German soil, it was also an international conflict driven by the varied dynastic, political, and territorial aims of two major European alliances. On the one side were the German Holy Roman Emperor, the Spanish monarchy, and a number of lesser German rulers, such as the Duke of Bavaria. And on the other side were the rulers of France, Sweden, and a number of other lesser German rulers, such as the Elector of the Palatinate and the Landgravine of Hesse-Kassel. These grand alliances were not fixed, with some parties, such as the Elector of Saxony, moving from one side to the other, and other parties, such as the Dutch regents, the King of Denmark, and even the Prince of Transylvania, engaging at some times and not others. If the complex and intertwined rationales for war among these many participants meant that fighting could not be ended anytime soon, some within the empire argued that it would at least be preferable for it to take place outside the borders of the empire. To these observers, the only way to save innocent German lives and end the ruination of the empire's cities and villages was for Germans to stop fighting among themselves and instead band together to expel all foreign forces. The empire's suffering, in this understanding, was caused by its internal division and weakness, and so could only be ameliorated by unity and strength. An example of this sentiment can be seen in an anonymous 1635 pamphlet that criticized some Germans for allying with the French and aiding French conquests along the Rhine. What would all German hearts think of them, the author asked, if through their actions they brought the fatherland with such a powerful neighbor and so brought the ancient acquired liberty into the most extreme danger, with the result that foreign potentates, peoples, and nations, after they suck the marrow from the bones of us Germans, shall also rule over and dominate us, divide the Holy Roman Empire among themselves, eliminate German liberty, and impose on us the unprecedented mockery of the yoke of slavery. the metaphorical servitude of Germans who ignored the needs of their fellow Germans in favor of taking money to fight for the French would also appear some years later in a work by Samuel von Pufendorf. Germans must be careful, he argued, not to contribute to their own servitude by assisting France, as happens when they do not conjoin their counsels and strength to repulse the enemy that threatens them all, but either incline together to ruin their fatherland because they've been bought by French gold, or sit by quietly, corrupted by noxious bribes, without a care for the public good, even though others are struggling, and they too will be devoured by Polyphemus and the rest, after the rest have been consumed. Of course, such efforts to drum up opposition to foreign intervention in the empire received some pushback from those very foreign powers, as well as from Germans who preferred a firmer adherence to a Protestant confessional identity over what they saw as a dangerously misguided attempt to create a pan-German ethnic unity under a Catholic emperor. An English account from 1632, for example, mocked the Lutheran Duke of Saxony for siding with the Catholic Holy Roman Emperor against his fellow German Protestants. The emperor's ambassador, the English author wrote, had flattered the Duke with that glorious style of being the pillar of the empire and the Achilles of Germany. But those of other nations by broad daylight could discern that the Elector of Saxony was likely another day to find no other favor at the emperor's hands than what Ulysses of old requested of the giant Polyphemus, to be the last man that should be eaten. It is also interesting to note that some of the attempts to survive unifying and strengthening across European Protestant religious identity did so by deliberately dehumanizing other Christian groups or confessions. For example, soon after the burning and destruction of the Lutheran city of Magdeburg in June 1631 by Catholic imperial forces, during which as many as 20,000 city residents were killed, a Protestant pastor from Bremen, Petrus Zimmermann, preached a sermon in which he portrayed Catholics not just as threatening, but actively satanic, arguing that the piteous misfortune of Magdeburg should serve as a terrible mirror of bloody persecution in which we can see quite plainly the great wrath of Satan towards us, which can also befall us should we pass into the hands of the enemy of the gospel. In the same way, a Calvinist pastor from the village of Hexheim described his horror when Catholics of the nearby city of Mainz celebrated the fall of Magdeburg with a procession to the Church of Our Lady with drums and pipes, as if the Blessed Virgin Mary up in heaven had such a murderous, bloodthirsty heart as they. Painting these Catholics as akin to cannibals, he argued that the papists cannot get enough of innocent blood here on earth. Part 2, fighting back. Still trapped in the cave with Polyphemus, having watched some of his crewmen being brutally killed and eaten, Ulysses hatched a daring plan to incapacitate the giant with wine and then stab him through the eye with a fire-hardened wooden stake. When the olive wood stake was glowing hot, Ulysses recounted, and ready to catch fire despite its greenness, I drew it from the coals. Then my men stood round me, and a god breathed courage into us. They held the sharpened olive wood stake and thrust it into his eye, while I threw my weight on the end and twisted it round and round, and the blood poured out despite me. His lids and brows were scorched by flame from the burning eyeball, and its roots crackled with fire. Like Ulysses facing Polyphemus, ordinary German peasants and country folk were no match for the strength of through-marching armies and well-armed mercenary soldiers. And yet, despite this, they did occasionally attempt to fight back or defend themselves and their farms, villages, or cities by whatever means were available. Yet such acts of civilian defiance, while occasionally successful, also courted retaliatory violence. Thus, Colonel Robert Monroe, commander of a regiment of Scots soldiers serving the Swedish king in Germany, described a frantic attempt by some local farmers to block the quartering of troops, a plan that only resulted in the poor farmers' deaths. Physically resisting or fighting back against trained soldiers was generally foolhardy, in other words, and almost never ended well for ordinary non-combatants. Indeed, as the two sides were usually very unequally balanced, any effort at self-defense was often tantamount to suicide. A peasant journal explained what happened to those who resisted the occupation of an invading army outside Ulm. No town was strong enough to fend them off, although several began to do so, but it turned out badly. I also began the same thing at Weidenstetten, but it went awry for us, for we fended them off for 2 days and drove away many bold groups of riders, and we took all of our livestock and horses into the churchyard and all of our poor belongings into the churches, but it did not help. And because we defended ourselves for a long time, they set fire to the town and burnt 5 houses and 5 barns. When this happened, our affair was lost. Every man let his weapon fall and ran to take care of his own. Opposition to peasants or villagers fighting back came not only from occupying armies, however. The idea of an enraged, armed, and out-of-control peasantry was not something any 17th century government official, property holder, or member of the nobility liked to contemplate. Out of fear of their own people, therefore, and to limit incidents of peasant attacks on soldiers, and thus avoid the violent and sometimes outscaled retribution on local communities that inevitably followed, local governments would occasionally forbid any armed resistance or would purposefully disarm their own peasantry. Furthermore, in situations where local officials or territorial princes had arranged with occupying troops for the controlled and regulated extraction of contributions, that is, they had formalized and given some official recognition to the rights of the soldiers to subsist off the peasantry, peasant violence or even flight became a direct challenge to local governmental authority and legitimacy. Peasants caught resisting such legitimized extractions or attacking such troops could thus face reprisals both from the occupying forces and from their own rulers. Despite the efforts of authorities, however, peasants continued to offer scattered attempts at self-defense, but also fought back in other ways, including opportunistic or spontaneous offensive violence. Such guerrilla tactics would normally be used not against full regiments or large bodies of troops, however, but against military stragglers and smaller groups of soldiers. We see numerous documentary accounts of such attacks, which could be just as bloodthirsty as the soldiers' own behavior and include robbery, murder, or more gruesome incidents of soldiers being stabbed in their sleep or tortured to death. Here one evening I drank a bit too much, a soldier wrote, and in the morning lagged a stone's throw behind the regiment on account of my headache. 3 peasants were hiding in a hedge and put up a good fight against me. They took my coat, satchel, and everything. But then, by an act of divine providence, all at once they sprang off me as if they were being hunted, and although there was no other person there behind them. So thus I came back to the regiment battered, without a coat and without a satchel, and they just laughed at me. Such a happy escape could not be expected, as encounters like this where the one-time peasants might have the upper hand against their hated oppressors. The Scottish Colonel Robert Munro, for example, described how one of his officers was killed by peasants when he was following the regiment in northern Germany. Munro warned his fellow military men that it did not matter if peasants or civilians were technically friendly or were the subjects of an ally prince, since they could all pose a threat to unaccompanied or unmounted officers. Considering that the soldiers themselves often failed to make any distinction between civilians in friendly territories and those in enemy territories, it is unsurprising that peasants might be equally contemptuous of the difference. Some scholars have also noticed a tendency in both groups to see the other as somehow inhuman or monstrous. This may be one reason for the prevalence of popular rumors that occupying soldiers, such as the Croatian troops shown here on the right, that regularly engaged in cannibalism or other gruesome behavior, such as fashioning hat bands out of people's noses and ears. Accounts suggesting the common man's general hatred for all soldiers appears as well in contemporary literature, such as von Grimmelhausen's Adventures of Simplicissimus. In this fictional account of life during the 30 Years' War, which was based in part on the author's own wartime experiences, Grimmelshausen vividly depicted the hostility and contempt that soldiers and peasants held toward each other. In one graphic scene, a group of peasants came upon 6 soldiers out foraging for food, overwhelmed them, and shot 5 on the spot. The 6th they mutilated by cutting off his ears and nose, then burying him alive in a barrel. In retaliation, other soldiers then killed some of the peasants and sadistically tortured the rest. Part 3, flight and trickery. After injuring and blinding Polyphemus, Ulysses and his men still faced the problem of escaping from the giant's cave. And yet the cyclops, Ulysses related, groaning and in pain, sat in the entrance, arms outstretched to catch anyone stealing past among his sheep. To save himself and his men, Ulysses stated that he, quote, dreamed up all sorts of tricks and schemes as a man will in a life or death manner. And then he hatched upon an ingenious plan. The rams in the cyclops cave, he recounted, were fat with thick fleeces, fine large beasts with deep black wool. These I silently tied together in threes with twists of willow on which that lawless monster Polyphemus slept. The middle one was to carry one of my men, while the other 2 on either side to protect him. So there was a man to every 3 sheep. As for me, I took the pick of the flock and curled below his shaggy belly, gripped his back and lay there face upward, patiently gripping his fine fleece tight in my hands. As soon as rosy-fingered dawn appeared, the males rushed out to graze, while the unmilked females, udders bursting, bleated in the pens. Their master, tormented by agonies of pain, felt the backs of the sheep as they passed him, but foolishly failed to see my men tied under the rams' bellies. Flight, or simply attempting to escape danger, is, one must say, one of the most easily understandable responses to being attacked in wartime. And this is indeed how most ordinary people dealt with the most overt dangers of the 30 Years' War. With some warning from neighboring towns of the imminent approach of enemy soldiers or invading armies, or from more elaborate early warning systems, peasants would be able to make a strategic retreat to the safest, most fortified place in town. In this land, there are high church towers, one soldier explained. Up above, on top of the towers, the peasants have tied a large basket attached to a long rope. If the sentinel who is on the tower sees soldiers coming, he then lets the basket down. The people then respond to this, and so everyone runs to the church, animals and people, and they leave the rest of the village standing empty. Such retreats could still be dangerous, however, for soldiers could simply set fire to the peasants' refuge and so force people out into their waiting arms. Better, therefore, though requiring more advanced notice of approaching soldiers, was escape to a safer location. Major fortresses, large walled cities or towns, caves, forests, or remote mountainous areas. As for their valuables, fleeing peasants would take with them whatever livestock and possessions they might be able to carry or easily transport, and attempt to conceal or bury the rest. A peasant diary of 1635 described just such a flight for one man and his family. The 12th day of June, I fled from my village with my wife and my small children to the city of Ulm. I had left after sunset at 8 o'clock, and in the morning around 5 o'clock, I was still not yet to the city. For the entire night, I traveled through hedges and shrubs, over hills and valleys, over thorns and debris, through crops and over ditches, so that I thought I would never reach Ulm. This was the most unpleasant trip I've ever taken from my youth until today. In the same way, the Bavarian abbess Clara Steiger, fleeing to the castle of Eichstätt in 1648, explained that as she and some of her fellow sisters fled their cloister from the nearby hilltop fortress, the concerns I felt for my other 20 sisters we had left behind, she wrote, filled me with such fear that I didn't know how I could possibly begin to drag myself to the castle. I was then dragged or carried under the arms more than I walked, until I came to the entrance. Here there immediately arose a melee among the refugees there, with screaming and hitting and pushing, for they would let into the castle no one but ecclesiastics and those who were there with them. A minister of the Swabian town of Calth Johann Andrea had a similar horrific experience in 1634, which he recounted in his diary. I joined a band of women and children, soon amounting to more than 200 people, he wrote. And like ants, we scurried over hills and rocks. After going about 20 miles, as if swept on by the wind, we arrived in the depth of night at Gernsbach, to the great consternation of the citizens there, who at first thought we were enemies. Since the enemy was also active in these parts and pillaging the whole neighborhood, and since we were nearly encircled, we decided to make an attempt to ask the victor for mercy. But to our further consternation, we had to flee once again into the hills where no one could readily follow us. From there, we wandered around, divided into smaller bands. When flight was impossible, particularly when people were trapped within city walls by one of the many sieges that were so characteristic of 17th century warfare, one could always hope for the miraculous arrival of a friendly army that would chase away or defeat the enemies outside the gate. Failing this, however, a negotiated surrender was usually the best solution, especially as it was an understood rule of war that if an army took a city by storm, the soldiers would be allowed by their officers 24 hours of unbridled looting and pillaging. Another option, and one that does appear, though rarely in the sources, is the use of imaginative methods to trick a besieging army into leaving. One famous story occurred in the city of Bitburg. Having been entirely surrounded by the Swedish army for weeks, and having no way either to escape or bring in supplies, the people of the city had come close to starvation and were almost ready to capitulate. Desperate to avoid the violence and hardship that would surely result even from a negotiated surrender, however, the citizens came up with a plan. They would try to convince the besieging Swedes that even after so long, the city still had plenty of food and could easily withstand many more weeks of siege. In a scheme reminiscent of Ulysses, the city residents sewed costumes from the skins of slaughtered goats and had their children dress up in the skins and prance along the top of the city walls on all fours like a flock of healthy goats. From a distance, the ruse must have appeared believable because, according to local legend, the angry and frustrated Swedes packed up their camp and marched away. Bitburg and its people were saved. As the last point on this topic, one should also note that non-combatants were not the only ones who might flee or scheme to avoid wartime violence and death. The practice of soldiers enlisting, collecting their signing bonus, and then running away before seeing combat was so common during the war that officers often had to corral all new recruits in a special guarded camp during enlistment drives, or refuse to issue pay until armies had reached the field. And even then, colonels frequently reported with some frustration the loss of scores of troops to desertion, both before and during every battle. As an indication of how seriously military leaders took such problems, the Swedish rules of war, to which all soldiers were forced to swear, all Swedish soldiers were forced to swear, laid out dire consequences for those who tried to sneak away when any march was to be made. And death was the penalty for any man who ran away from his company's standards while in the field. Moreover, the rule states that if there is any occasion to enter a castle, town, or fortification by assault or breach, he who flees from the place before he's come to blows with the enemy and has used his sword, so far as it is possible for him to do service with it and before he's fought off by the main strength of the enemy, shall be punished as the court decides to censure him. If a larger act of group cowardice was led by an officer, the rules went on to state that, quote, he shall be publicly disgraced for it and then ejected from the camp. But if the fault is the soldiers alone, then every 10th man shall be hanged. The rest shall be condemned to carry all the filth out of the camp until such a time as they perform some exploit that is worthy to procure their pardon, after which time they shall be clear of the former disgrace. But if any man can, by the testimony of 10 men, prove himself from the beginning not guilty of the cowardice, he shall go free. Conclusion. Ulysses' escape from Polyphemus's cave was successful, but as he and his men rowed away, he could not help but taunt the cyclops, causing the giant to hurl a large stone at the fleeing men and cry out to his father, the god Poseidon. "Hear me, Poseidon, dark-tressed earth-bearer," the Cyclops prayed. "Let Ulysses, sacker of cities and son of Laertes, never reach his home in Ithaca. Yet if he is destined to see his friends and his fine house in his own country, may he come there late and in sore distress, in another's ship, losing all comrades, and let him find great trouble in his house." As anyone who has read the Odyssey knows, Polyphemus's curse was effective, and Ulysses' homecoming would be both long delayed and tragic. A similar fate befell the residents of Central Europe in the 17th century. The war did end, finally, but only late, in 1648, after many long years of great distress. Even then, it was to take another few years for all the soldiers to be dismissed, for refugees to straggle back to their burnt or abandoned villages, or to find new homes in more hospitable areas, and for houses, barns, mills, roads, and orchards to be rebuilt or restored to their former usefulness. There was no way to repair the loss of so many lives, of course. Friends, family, neighbors, and colleagues had been lost not through such things as the hunger of mythical monsters or the wrath of Zeus, like Ulysses' men, but to the very real dangers of the war, as well as to the disease and starvation that had accompanied it. By some estimates, as many as 8 million people died over the 3 decades of the war, an almost unimaginable number. Throughout it all, moreover, contemporaries faced another underlying problem of identifying who exactly was the monstrous cannibalistic enemy in this war and who the bold hero Ulysses. Was this a battle of Catholics against Protestants, Germans against foreigners, soldiers against peasants? Strategies for survival often depended on how people answered this question, which complicated responses and deepened the sense of crisis and trauma. And yet, as this talk has demonstrated, many, indeed most, did find a way to survive the war. They negotiated with enemies, they used persuasion to limit violence or solicit aid, they tried to find allies and rally friends, they warned each other of danger or used trickery to deter enemies, they fought back when they could, and they ran away when there was nothing else left to do. So while modern eyes are naturally drawn toward the destruction and pain of this era, the remarkable resilience of the people of 17th century Central Europe is perhaps a more interesting phenomenon. It also offers at least some hope for those of us today suffering from our own seemingly intractable divisions and deadly challenges. Finding our way home may be difficult and full of grief, and we may not even recognize it when we arrive. But if we can figure out how to not end up as a cyclops sufferer, we may at least stand a chance. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tryntje, for this really marvelous presentation that lays out a whole array of different survival strategies. And I think that's sort of hit a key point. When we think of the 30 Years' War, we so often just think of destruction and loss of life, and appreciate your emphasis here on how the ordinary man and woman survived during this period. Well, I'm sure that we have a number of questions for our speaker today, so why don't we open things up? You can feel free just to chime in. We have some folks monitoring chat as well. You can put questions there too, but please do chime in questions. Perhaps I'd be happy to start us off a bit. I have 2 issues. I mean, that this brought up so many big issues. The first was what you ended with, and that's going back to this whole issue of loss of life. And I think many of us have seen sort of wildly divergent figures on how many lives were lost, especially in Central Europe. I've heard estimates of up to a third of the population. And of course, those are very, very difficult numbers to get at, and at best we can only have some type of rough estimate. But I was wondering if A, you could sort of tell us what the most recent thinking is on that, and B, and this is taking us in a different direction. Well, I'll just start with A, and if we have time, we can get to B a little bit later.
So that's a really excellent question. I don't have the most recent updates on that. It seems though one of the problems that scholars face in figuring out how many people died is how varied it was. I mean, certain areas were completely wiped off the map. Like, I mean, Magdeburg obviously is a great example, but entire towns were just gone. But other places actually prospered during the war. If they served as a place where people could get supplies or as a financial center, they had increased population. So, I mean, you have places with 100% losses, places with 60% losses. It's so varied that to try to get good numbers is incredibly frustrating. I just went with sort of the old standard of 8 million dead, but it's just a horrible problem to figure out. And of course, the medieval scholars are still struggling with the same thing with the Black Death numbers. And they can have entire conferences over how many died. So I don't even know how statisticians deal with these problems. It's just crazy.
Right. Good. Thank you. Other questions?
What was your second question?
My second question was actually about getting back to this issue of agency, and you started us off under your category of negotiation and persuasion. You had a comment there about peasants fighting back, but fighting back in the courts. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit there, what small peasant victories there might have been in this time of great trouble for them.
Yeah, it is really interesting. There's been some research recently into exactly that topic, and little village communities would launch a lawsuit and would demand lower taxation, for example, and would send representatives to higher courts, princely courts, and sometimes, as I said, they won. Improved conditions. I mean, the thing is, when you look at these contribution agreements, if an army comes in and says, we want this much stuff, the local government has to decide how to apportion that burden. And that's where the peasants had some wiggle room. That's where they could say, hey, the last army that came in killed half of our population. We can't bear that kind of burden now. You have to lessen it. And so they did have successes in those ways. There's also attempts by governments in this era to institute census records to try to figure out what's left and what can be taxed. And in those studies, you see a lot of local peasant communities and town councils very aware that a census is a dangerous thing. And so they would try to emphasize their losses and in order to avoid tax later on. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways in which these communities could sort of work the system and try to improve their circumstances. And they would also send representatives to generals. We do see town councils or village councils sending people to the general's camp and being escorted in to talk to the general or his leading officers to say, your men are misbehaving, you have to do something about it. And you do find soldiers arrested and punished sometimes when they violate these agreements, because it's especially these contribution agreements become very formalized, and it's much easier for generals if it all goes really smoothly and they don't have to attack the local communities, but can just come in and get their supplies handed to them.
Right. Good, thank you. Right. Others, any other questions for Professor Helfferich.
Hi. I was wondering, you talked about how the peasants would hide in the churches in their city centers, and I was wondering how successful the strategy actually was and whether this religious factor did actually deter the armies from destroying the town.
That's a great question. So often churches had at least some rudimentary form of wall around them. If the army was just marching through, that could be successful. So it's sort of like where they say, you know, if you lock your car in a parking lot, the casual thief is going to go to the unlocked car. So you deter the casual violence. If an army or a group of men was absolutely determined to get whatever belongings those peasants had, the peasants were toast. I mean, and that was very common for the soldiers in those circumstances to set fire to the outside of the church, and that would, or to the town, and then the peasants would all have to rush out. So I would say that it did work sometimes, enough so that the peasants would try that first, usually. I forget the second part of your question. Oh, the religious angle. There is definitely religious violence during this war. I think I showed you an image of priests slain on the altar. Let me see if I can go back to that one, because I think it's kind of cool. This is from an English, let me see if I can get this back. An English account. You guys see this, the thing again?
Yep.
Just see the conclusion.
Okay, hold on, let me go back to this.
Okay, now you're moving.
Oh, this one. I don't know if you can see this up at the top right. It says priests slain at the altar. There was a lot of accounts of Protestant troops attacking Catholic clergy, killing them, and destroying churches. And in fact, if you travel around Europe today, a lot of churches in Germany have little plaques where they complain about the Swedish troops in particular. It's really quite kind of sad. You know, they're like, well, we had a really beautiful mural here until 1640 when the Swedish troops came in and trashed it. And if you start looking for those, you see them everywhere. So there was a lot of religious violence where Catholic troops would specifically attack Protestant clergy and Protestant churches, and vice versa. And some of these alliances that I mentioned were cross-confessional. So the Catholic French were allying with Protestant German princes. And in those alliance agreements, they would often have specific statements that said, when your troops are in our religious area, you can't let them perpetrate religious violence. And that worked to some extent to limit it, but not always. Yeah, great question.
Others, please jump in. Well, we have the, oh, no, please do it, Allison.
I'm sorry.
No, please go.
I had a question about the soldiers themselves. Were they just attacking peasants and looting for their own benefit, or were they told to do so by the higher ups? And also, were these like really well-trained soldiers, or were they just kind of peasants from Germany who needed money and a job?
Yeah, excellent questions. Thank you. So the first point is, in some instances, they were just sadistic, horrible people, and they enjoyed the violence. I mean, that's what it sounds like in some cases. In other cases, they were not paid. So usually, some soldiers did receive pay, but very few, and often pay was behind. So there's some examples of the associated Dutch 80 Years' War, where some of those troops hadn't been paid for decades. And the only way they would get paid is if they revolted against their officers and started to loot the town. So sometimes soldiers do this kind of violence strategically in order to force their officers to pay them, which is kind of crazy. And sometimes they're just horrible people. and sometimes both at the same time, I suppose. Sometimes they just needed food, and they're going through, and there's been a lot of discussion about to what extent soldiers saw peasants as human or not. I sort of started to bring that up. Some studies have highlighted that aspect of it, that they purposefully dehumanize the other group, but others have said it's been overplayed. So I can't say to what extent, but part of the problem is that a lot of these soldiers are peasants or were peasants. You're living in the middle of a war zone, you've got no prospects, you join up and you become a soldier. There was very little, to answer your second question, there was very little training. You learned on the job. Officers had pretty good training, but ordinary soldiers learned on the job. And if you survived, you became a veteran, and you could get higher pay if you were had gone through a few battles because you knew what you were doing. To some extent, there had to be a little bit of training, because the way they fought, it was not just like a big mob of people rushing towards another group. They had to march in squares. And so that did require a little bit of drill, but it's pretty basic. Hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you.
We have a couple questions that have come through chat. Ashley, would you like to jump in, or I'd be happy to read it as well?
Yeah, hi. I was just wondering, you did mention briefly that there are plaques, that said that there were specific artworks in churches or chapels, or just even maybe manor homes that have been destroyed or possibly looted. And I was just wondering if any of those artworks have since been identified, maybe recently, maybe not so recently, and if they were ever returned to their place of origin, or are they just lost forever, or perhaps in foreign museums?
Yeah, that's, again, a really good question. So the some of the things that were seized in war were just destroyed. There's a lot of melting down of valuables. So if you haven't, gold plate or nice things made of metal, they might have been melted down during the 30 Years' War. But a lot of artwork is moved around as loot. When Frederick of the Palatinate, for example, is chased out of the Palatinate, his entire art, library and a bunch of his artworks are packed up, and I think they're sent to the Vatican, which I think still has them. So some of these things you can still find in the places where they were seized. I do not think there's been any kind of movement to return artwork stolen during the 30 Years' War, but it's actually a really good point. I mean, you see that now with artworks taken during later wars, or people want those back, but in this era, you don't really see that. If I had a church and I knew that we had a really cool thing and it was now, in Sweden, I would demand it back. So that's actually be a really good move for a foreign litigator, I think, right now. Great question.
Yeah, no, I would just jump in too and add that if you want to see a lot of Central European art and sort of cultural products, just go to Sweden today, because there's a fair amount of that up there, in libraries as well. Right, good. We have another question from Angela Chen. Angela, would you like to, again, I'd be happy to read this out as well, but if you'd want to jump in and elaborate a bit.
Yeah, so you mentioned some, well, I guess just these photos, rumors of like cannibalism going on, and or like picking people's ears and noses.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if like these rumors were like xenophobic and like toward like outsiders from like different places or like different religions, Catholic, Protestant, or if they were more like these soldiers are like really like inhumane.
So the rumors are interesting. The Croatians in general have a very bad reputation, and I think they must have done bad stuff. I mean, I don't think it was completely imagined I don't think that they're like eating children. Like you see this picture here, a Croat eat children, a little baby leg in his mouth. I mean, I'm pretty sure they didn't do that, but I would not be surprised if there were some incidents where various groups of soldiers did cut off ears to make hat bands. I mean, I think, or necklaces. I think it's a war, and it's a religious war, and really horrific things did happen. And it wasn't the one side or the other wasn't better than the other. There's a famous torture technique called the Swedish Drink, which is basically like waterboarding, but often they wouldn't use clean water. They would use filthy water or piss, and they would force it down someone's throat until their gut distended, and then you might jump on the gut and like everything would burst. And I mean, it's just horrible. It's like a really horrible, horrible way to, like you're drowning and then you could be killed. They called it the Swedish Drink as if it's just the Swedes that were doing it. But there's many instances reported of the other side doing that sort of thing as well. And the soldiers would do that not just to be horrible, but in order to extract the possessions of peasants who had hidden them, or wealthy people who'd hidden gold or whatever. So when you really start looking into some of the brutality and the violence of this era, it's actually quite horrifying. I don't know how else to say it. It's bad, and I don't think you can say any one group rose above it. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Thank you. Any further questions?
Does anybody have a happier question? Sorry, that was a horrible way to end.
Well, I liked your ending and trying to have a little bit more positive spin on thing, and thinking about survival as opposed to the casualties as well. So
this picture here is nice. They've got the kids dressed up in goat skin. Are called the Geesestripper, and they have a beer, which I just think is charming, with the little picture of the goat peering over the city walls. That's a happier topic.
Right. No, that was a great story. Good. Well, I think without any further ado, we can thank Professor Helfferich for this really wonderful lecture, and some very, very interesting stories that I was unaware of, connected with the 30 Years War and survival in this period. So thank you very much for your time and your observations today.
Well, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.